Hey everyone, this is Thomas from Matters of Mind, and today I'm going to be talking about Volume 2 of A History of Religious Ideas by Mircea Eliade. And in Volume 2, he goes from Gautama Buddha to the triumph of Christianity. This is the second of three volumes, and I feel kind of proud of myself when I look at it sideways, one and two. That's a whole lot of reading about some deep fundamental stuff. So I feel like I've got a bit of a glimpse into the matrix of
He is the one.
humanity. And sometimes that's how I feel whenever I finish reading a book or while I'm reading a book like that, to where it's not always super entertaining. In fact, it's almost never super entertaining. But it's kind of like doing homework, and I'm getting a picture into part of the code and the patterns that really make up what it means to be human. So when it comes to tackling Jordan Peterson's reading list, it's not always entertaining, but it is incredibly rewarding. I feel like I really learned a lot from these two books, and I'll pretend that I'm looking forward to volume 3. Although I will do it, I'm going to take a break. The break I'm taking will be to go over The Master and His Emissary. Dr. Ian McGilchrist has been on Dr. Peterson's show many times, and I'm always fascinated by what they talk about and what he talks about in his research. So I'll go through that book, and then after that, I'll get on to volume 3. But today I wanted to start with something related to the book, only because it was an experience that I had while reading volume 2. Now, I'm going to give you a little background and context here. So, not too long ago, I had a dream where I was sitting in a classroom, and picture Goodwill Hunting, where you see that incredibly complicated um, mathematical or whatever kind of equation up on a board. And I was in a classroom like that by myself, and the person teaching the class visually was me. So I was a student and the teacher. And the only thing I really remember about this is um, that view, and then realizing that I was dreaming. And a habit that I have, I think a lot of people have, is once you realize you're dreaming, your mind says, oh, it's time to wake up. And I always do that. I wake myself up as soon as I realize that I'm dreaming. And as I'm kind of pulling away, almost like the circle is getting smaller and smaller, like when you're passing out, but you're going into consciousness, me teaching that class looks at me and says, none of this is going to make sense when you wake up. And I took that to be a sort of separation between my conscious logical mind and my unconscious mind that doesn't necessarily look to reason and logic and is much more symbolically associated. Um, Now, the reason I say that is because I had that experience to a lesser extent while reading volume 2 while I was awake. So I was reading a portion on unity. I can't remember the context of it in the book, but it didn't seem to be specifically focused on what it was I was reading. But that same voice, which was similar to that person who was telling me that when I wake up, none of this was going to make sense. It was like that voice came up in the middle of my reading, blocked everything else out, and kind of popped its head up like a groundhog and said, "Creation and divinity are the same word," and just went back away. It was almost like something woke up in me and said that and went back to sleep. And it was like the same voice. And the weird thing about it was, it wasn't just saying they are the same thing. It was like it was telling me, no, 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 you don't get it. They literally are the same thing. They're the same word. They're spelled the same, even though you think they're not spelled the same, because divine and creation are spelled differently, obviously, but they're spelled the same. It's the same thing. Um, and I think that's happening maybe more and more in my dream, and then even while I'm reading, because all of these ideas, all these religious ideas, are getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the fundamentals of what it means to be human, which is in part a development of a conscious mind that's very new and very young as compared to our unconscious minds. So I'm starting to think of them as two separate personalities almost. And that's how they're represented to me in my dreams and in that experience, to where sometimes things that I normally wouldn't associate together logically or reasonably are coming up in a dream state and trying to communicate something to me. And in this case, the idea that divine and creation are the same thing, it makes some sense once you start understanding what creation is in a religious or specifically biblical sense, and what it means to be divine. And also ties into what it means to be, when the Bible says, created in the image of God. Because the first thing God does in Genesis is create the world, separate light and dark, day and night, land and sea. It's starting. He's creating all of these things by differentiating and defining, which you can't do one without the other, and getting more and more specific and shaping the world. So he's looking at the potential of chaos and creating order out of it. And that's what human beings do. They see potential in anything. That could be potential in a tree, to where, yes, that's a tree, but if I manipulate it, it can be a table, it can be a chair, it can be a cup, it can be a bowl, it can be fuel for a fire, it can heat my house, it could transform, and then that fire can transform meat into something that's more digestible and bioavailable and give me a bigger brain, and on and on and on. Even coal or natural gas or oil, those are all things that are chaotic potential that we then use creation and manipulate them into other things. So that's what it means to be human, is to see the potential in our material world and change it into, create some order around that chaos and see that potential, and create something that useful for us. So I think that's what whatever that voice was is telling me. But it's interesting. I expect that the more I read things like this, maybe the more, and if I purposely probably pay attention to that stuff and look for it, I'm curious if I'll have more experiences like that. But now let's get into some of these stuff that I actually read in the book, not just the experiences I've had. Now, volume 2 starts out with ancient Chinese religious thought. And it takes a previous theme, something that I've talked about before with microcosm and macrocosm, and talks about how what was specific about the Chinese religious ideas was that they take that concept and expand it into yin and yang. And let me do a little explanation about what microcosm and macrocosm are. So the way that people were utilizing religion is to describe the world of humanity. And to describe something, we always have to take into account what we already know and see that new thing in relation to what we already know. And what we already know is humanity. So we tend to project humanity into the universe when describing the universe. And that's how the whole microcosm macrocosm thing starts out, because we see the universe almost like a human being and use those things to describe it, even though the microcosm ourselves is much smaller than the universe. So we are the microcosm, the universe is the macrocosm, and describing things on all different levels, from the individual to the universal, is usually done in that framework, to where you're taking something you know in that microcosm, which is humanity, and expanding it and using that framework to describe everything in the universe on bigger and bigger scales. Now, and I alluded to this here already, but the most common analogy, and that's what it really is a microcosm and macrocosms, they're analogies of each other. The most common one is the vertical and horizontal axis, and that comes into play specifically because of something Eliade talked about in the first volume, which is human beings stand upright, unlike any other primate. So that gives us a vertical perspective on the world. And when we're conscious, we're utilizing that um, reasoned, logical, conscious mind to view the material world. And that's why heaven is up and earth is down, because our feet are in contact with the earth. Our mind, the divine, the creative potential, our ability to see chaos and change it into order, we think of that with our minds, use our brains. So you have your brains up here and your feet down here at the earth. So conscious, unconscious. And then when you're horizontal and you're asleep, that's when you tend to lay on the ground and your mind comes down back into the realm of chaotic earth and unconscious. So the vertical and horizontal axis matches directly up with the manner in which humanity is built and the way that we have the macrocosm now. Now, that macrocosm, the whole universe is built in that way to where heaven's above, earth is below. And then everything that goes from that center point outward is the known and the unknown. So the manner in which we just stand up and the difference between our minds and how they work when we're conscious and unconscious is the microcosm that we then project into the macrocosm of the universe. Now, some examples of how widespread this is, there's a reason that Jacob's ladder goes up and down. So if you don't remember the story of Jacob, um, he lays down in the desert, uses a rock for his pillow. Then he has a dream about Jacob's ladder, which this ascends up into heaven, and it's a spiraling staircase. And that's significant because previously man thought of history as a cycle that just keeps coming to the same point. But with Jacob's ladder, it's a spiraling staircase where even though you have a cycle that you're going through, whether it's seasons or behaviors or civilizations, every time you come back to a similar point, you've gone up the ladder. So you're still ascending and progressing through history, not just going through a cycle. Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack's beanstalk, to find the gold or the golden egg, he doesn't take a path outwards. He has to climb up to get the gold. And you'll also see that with churches, especially a lot of the older Orthodox churches where they have the gold at the top of the church. It's the same concept. You're going up toward heaven and keeping your eyes focused on what matters, and that's where the gold is, the rare stuff. Even in the Greek religion, you have Mount Olympus where the gods live. Not only are the gods reflective of personalities, the microcosm of humanity reflected up in their personalities, but they're up in Mount Olympus. And then the land of the dead is down below. So it's an up and down, heaven and hell, heaven and earth, order and chaos. So when Odysseus in the Odyssey has to go down to the land of the dead, he has to go down to the land of the dead. It's not just a horizontal path. Now, there's also another practical example how that translates into our modern world. So as the pilgrims or whoever came over from Europe and mostly England to settle in what later on became the United States, the very first thing they did was create a covenant. A covenant is an agreement, very simple, similar to what the rainbow was for Noah. There's the covenant that Moses had with God, which is an agreement. It's a relational contract to say, if you do this, then we'll do this. The pilgrims did that very same thing. They stepped onto the land and they said, we need to first establish a church. And they would write a covenant saying something to the effect of, we are these people, this is our aim, and this is the manner in which we will do it in the eyes of God and all that is holy, etc., etc. So what that did is created a center. That's the X and Y axis. And that center is a place which is a church. And that church is a place where they can go and look up to the heavens. They keep their eyes on the gold, And everything that goes horizontally, the further and further away you get from that center, is more and more unknown. It's the same thing. The church is a microcosm of the universe, to where that's where they have the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis, circular around the church, is also there as well. Now, Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist scientist, pointed this out somewhat similarly when it came to biology. One of the things that he said is, if an alien happened to get a hold of a creature from Earth, all of the things that are inherent in that creature are reflective of the environment in which they came. So let's say if we got a pigeon and put it in a capsule and sent it off, and somehow we kept it in cryostasis, and some alien civilization found it and knew it came from Earth, just by examining that pigeon, they would be able to know a lot about Earth. Because if they could figure out that this pigeon was able to fly, then they would know something about the gravity of Earth and the air composition. It needs oxygen, so this place that came from must have oxygen. It needs water. Wherever it came from, it must have water. All of these things about the um, characteristics of that animal would reflect the environment from which it came. So that bird in itself is a microcosm of the earth itself. So all of these things, you start to see these patterns and how all of these ideas are described throughout. Now, what Chinese thought did was take that microcosm, macrocosm idea that was describing the universe, almost very much like a cosmology, and take it into principles as well. So it wasn't just the earth and the universe, almost like a metaphysical explanation of the world, but it was the principles of how we operate in the world. Yin and yang was chaos and order, femininity and masculinity, night and day, the unknown, the known, decadence, authoritarianism, nihilism, and fascism. So it took that and really expanded it into all these complementary principles with which to understand human behavior along with the cosmology of the world. And if you look at the yin yang symbol, it looks very similar to a snake eating its tail. And you can see that part is dark, part is light. But within each darkness, within each section is a portion of the other section, recognizing that even though these two ideas, concepts, and cosmologies are separated and different, and there's a very specific difference between them, there's still an aspect of the opposite within it. So they really look at the being able to separate all of these things, but still recognizing that there's an aspect of everything within the other. I would say better, there's an aspect of every item within its opposite. There we go. Another way of thinking about this is the difference between good and evil, which is one of the most basic fundamental concepts. It's one of the very first things that in the biblical story of creation of man specifically, is what separated us from the animals and made us a bit more like the gods. So in order to have good, you must have evil, because once you define something, you differentiate it. So you can't say what is good without being able to say what is not good. So that's another way to look at these analogies, and understanding that there's a bit of each in the other, because one can't survive or even exist or be conceptualized without the other. Another interesting thing that I read about Chinese religious thought is something that seemed to parallel Christianity, Christian thought. And let me quote this here. Like the true Taoist, the best of princes is the one whose existence is not known. Since the heavenly Tao triumphs without striving, the most effective ways of obtaining power are Wu Wei and non-violence. The supple and the weak overcome the unyielding and the strong. Weakness is the function of the Tao. This reminded me of the Christian idea of the meek shall inherit the earth. And meekness isn't necessarily just weakness, but I think more of the word humility, to where you're aware of the things you don't know and you're willing to intake new information and adjust yourself. And in order to do that, you have to be willing to be soft and supple and adjust. Because if you're hard and rigid with your ideology, there's no way that new things can come into your mind and you can understand them. It also reminds me of something that Bruce Lee once said.
This is what it is, okay? I said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
Now, the significance of this worldview, I don't think can be understated. Anyone who reads history, ancient history, throughout Roman and the conquering times, Napoleon, Alexander, all of that, when that was going on, it was just assumed that a strong nation would then go conquer other nations. And that was a macrocosm of what happened in the microcosm of everyday life. People just thought that whoever was strong was right, and they had the ability to do what they want. The historian Thucydides said, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Of the gods we believe, and of men we know, that by a necessary law of their nature, they rule wherever they can." Now, that seems to be almost the opposite of how people think of right and wrong today. It's essentially flipped, where anyone who is in power and compared to anyone who is weak, whoever is in power is automatically wrong and whoever is weak is automatically right. You see that a lot with social justice ideology, which, I understand that it could feel good to advocate for somebody who has less power, but the world, thankfully, is much more beautiful and complicated than simply who has power and who doesn't. There are a lot more things to consider, because you can be wrong and be weak, and you can be wrong and have power. It doesn't, being right or wrong or just or not isn't simply relegated to the amount of power that somebody has. Now, a little bit about Indian religious thought. One of the things I took away was that the basis for Indian religions is really the sense that our world is illusory, or a consequence of the ignorance of spirit. And it was almost as if the basis for a lot of Indian religion was that we need to ignore and get away from the material world, and as much as we can abandon it for the spiritual world. Really, you had to abandon it because it was corrupting of the spirit, um, in order to be able to fully experience the spiritual world. Now, that fundamental idea is important because it runs in sharp contrast to what we have in the Western world, which is the nature of the world, the material world as well, is good. So, if you've ever read the account of the biblical narrative for creation, which influences a lot of the Western world, after all the things that God created, in every verse he says, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good, over and over again. There's an emphasis on the creation, not just the metaphysics, not just God, not just the spirit, but everything that was created was good. Now, if you see the world that way and think of creation as not only good, but created by God, then understanding creation is a way to understand God, which is largely why you see a lot of people in monasteries, and a lot of the early scientific work coming out of monasteries and religious people, as they sought to get close with God through understanding his creation. Now, if you don't think that, and you're constantly trying to separate yourself from the material world, you may set yourself up to have less concern with the material world and the world of nature, as you're seeing it as a corrupting force. And that might be, in some sense, why different cultures tend to have different advances in different places for different reasons. Rightly or wrongly, all of these ideas make a difference, and they show up in our culture and our history. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is Buddhism. Now, I thought Buddhism was really interesting, and I've read the story of the Buddha before, and this one again. In every version of it, depending on the author, is going to give you a little more insight. But I really, really like the story of the Buddha. It's a nice story to read, and I really enjoy thinking about it and reading it. And essentially, this young prince is sheltered, but he keeps getting a glimpse of reality, unbeknownst to his royal family who's trying to keep him sheltered. And he decides, you know what, I want to get out into the world and experience it, much like Abraham when he left his tent to experience the world and have the adventure of his life. Buddha did the same thing. And experiencing that, he comes to a realization, and he sits under the tree, and he reaches nirvana. Now, you can go in and read the story of Buddha and get your own take on it. But there was one particular thing that stood out to me about this story and the way that Eliade describes Buddhism. Okay, I'm going to quote him here. Buddhism is the only religion whose founder declares himself to be neither the prophet of a god nor his emissary, and who, in addition, rejects the idea of a God supreme being. It reminded me of a conversation I had with a pretty outspoken, prominent, progressive person. And I don't know how we got into this, but she told me that being a secular person, she still wanted spirituality, but she was looking to Buddhism and was going to explore Buddhism. And I've always wondered what it was about Buddhism that attracted secular, atheist type people to explore it. What was it that they were looking for? And it made a little more sense. I got a glimpse into the matrix here, because it really is the only religion that doesn't have a god, it doesn't have a prophet, and their prophet, which he never called himself a prophet, never described himself as an emissary. So what the Buddha did is said that you should not consider oneself a supreme being, because there is no supreme beings. What you're looking to do is to be awakened to the true nature of reality and understand that it's something not to embrace, but to reject in order to achieve and maintain spiritual purity. And progressivism, especially today, is very much along those lines. They see the world as a socially constructed world that isn't necessarily the real world and actually corrupts humanity. And their critical social justice ideology does nothing but point out all the ways in which society corrupts and oppresses people in order to bring about some future where that no longer exists. So you have no God, you're an atheist, you want to critique the world in order to make it a better place. It's a secular version of Buddhism, and on a very loose way. So it was helpful to read that and start to understand why it was so many of my liberals slash progressive, more progressive friends really dislike religion, but somehow think that Buddhism is pretty cool. All right, so once again, it was a lot like homework, and it wasn't entertaining, but I had some great experiences reading the book. I learned a lot about the nature of humanity and religion. And after I take a break and read something about left and right brain lateralization from Dr. Ian McGilchrist, I'll get back and take care of volume 3. So thanks for joining me again. If you like and subscribe, I really appreciate it. It helps out the channel. To do what? I don't know, but that's what I'm supposed to be saying. So have a great day, and I'll see you in the books. Bye.